Man, I got huge disagreements with both sides of this conversation right now. When I look at the greatest threat right now to American values in the United States, it is the Trump administration, bar none. Make no mistake, I disagree almost completely with I would call it the pro-Palestinian historical revisionism that goes on their side. That being said, I mean, we have a current administration that doesn't believe in rule of law. There is a process, and you need to follow this process, and I can't think of anything more insane to me than deporting students from the United States of America because you have a viewpoint disagreement with them. So they weren't always welcomed with open arms. There were times where they were welcome, and there were times where as early as 1920 in Iran.
US university campuses have once again become a battleground for a war of words. The Trump administration has issued a list of demands to universities, compelling them to report students who are hostile to American values, ensuring academic departments are viewpoint diverse, and requiring them to hire a government-approved auditor to review programs and departments. Is the US really the land of the free if the government decides which freedoms to protect and which viewpoints are the right ones? To discuss the Trump administration's battle with American universities and its students, I'm joined by Shabbos Kestenbaum, a Harvard University and PragerU personality who's currently suing Harvard for anti-Semitism. Stephen Burnell, known online as Destiny, is a YouTuber who provides political commentary from a centre-left perspective. And Ahmed Eldin, a former adjunct professor at Columbia University and a journalist who writes on Substack. Gentlemen, thanks for being here on Counterpoints. The Trump administration wants to mandate opinion diversity on college campuses, is clamping down on student protests, and even using social media posts as grounds to revoke student visas. So, Shabbos, let's start with you, as you have direct experience with this. Is this pressure on universities and students and the protests justified?
Absolutely, and I take issue with the question. President Trump is not issuing a crackdown on universities. He's issuing a crackdown on specific universities. He's not talking about Florida State University, University of Chicago, Vanderbilt, University of Michigan. He's talking about the most elite, the most corrupt institutions like Harvard that have a $54 billion endowment, which is more money than most countries' GDP, that was found 2 years ago to have discriminated by the United States Supreme Court, to have discriminated against Asian Americans and their admissions criteria. This is a university that consistently amplified and celebrated a culture of anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism. And I used to be in the pretty far left of the ideological spectrum. I cannot for the life of me understand why it's the same far left campus activists who have made a martyr out of Harvard University, saying that we must protect this institution at all costs. What happened to ending the oligarchy and taxing the rich and having billionaires pay their fair share? No one has been able to explain to me why an institution with $54 billion needs $9 billion in American taxpayer money, why they receive $800 million in federal subsidies on an annual basis. And by the way, if Harvard does not want to accept this money, they don't have to. Trump is not forcing them to do anything. Harvard can say, we will only hire Democrats, which is what they're doing. We will discriminate against Asian Americans and white Americans and Jewish Americans. But what Harvard wants to do is they want to have their cake and eat it too. We want all of the money from the Americans, and we also want the Americans to go screw themselves because we will do whatever we want. It doesn't work that way.
And Harvard is not saying it will only employ Democrats, and they are saying that they're happy not to take the money. So, Destiny, what do you think? I mean, shouldn't it be hands off our educational institutions if the US is going to say that it supports freedom of thought?
Yeah, I thought that this administration came in saying that they wanted schools to decide how to educate their own students. It's interesting that the Republicans seem happy to dictate opinion or curriculum to an educational institution when it happens to be an educational institution that delivers opinions or students that have opinions that disagree with the current administration. I think that any American that has any value whatsoever to the idea of freedom of speech or freedom of thought or freedom of expression, especially on college campuses, should feel absolutely terrified that the administration is now running around and playing politics with attaching political mandates to grants that are being awarded to schools that do scientific research. I think it's absolutely insane that this administration is attacking some of our most well-known universities, our oldest universities, for ideological political purposes, which they've outwardly and overtly stated. And the fact is even if you bow to the administration like Colombia has, there's no guarantee that it'll even lift any of the funding restrictions that they've put on you. So there's no, I think, good reason for Harvard to play along here. And I don't think anybody, at least that values freedom of speech, should be cheering any of these decisions on.
Ahmed, let's Ahmed Eldin, to round out this first question. Isn't there an argument, though, as what the Trump administration is saying, is that this is fostering hate speech, it's fostering anti-Semitism, and there should be no place for that on university campuses?
I disagree that there's an argument there, and I just want to take a moment and take the macro lens for a minute. I mean, let's be clear about what we're debating. This is not an abstract idea, Melinda. We're witnessing the systematic stripping away of American civil liberties through a campaign that criminalizes not hate speech, but dissent and censors legitimate criticism of a foreign regime that is plausibly committing genocide. I'm bringing that up because we keep hearing that this is, from people like Shabbos and others, that this is about Judaism, that this is about anti-Semitism. It's not about that. It's about the deliberate conflation of the term anti-Semitism with any critique of Israel, which, by the way, Israel has killed more than 17,000 children in its genocidal war. It is blocking food, water, and medicine from an entire population. The definition of a war crime. Israel's leaders have international arrest warrants issued against them by the ICC. It's killing paramedics and then lying about it. I mean, look, Melinda, our academic institutions in the United States, the very places that nurtured free inquiry, free speech, and the questioning spirit, critical thinking, like Gaza, our universities are under siege. And if I may just mention, as a former Columbia University student and adjunct professor, I'd like to note that today, April 17th, is a special day. It's the one-year anniversary of Columbia's Gaza Solidarity Encampment, and it's also Palestinian Prisoners' Day. And I just want to highlight, when students first pitched their tents on Butler Lawn, they never imagined, nor should they have, how far their courage would take them, but also how brutal the crackdown would be. After months of rallies and protests, when they occupied parts of campuses, we saw immediately the state and the university move to crush them, exposing what I would describe as the true nature of Columbia University, which is an institution that, perhaps I can agree with some of what was said earlier, that is clearly choosing to put money and profit over people and free speech.
Shabbos, you're rolling your eyes. What would you like to respond?
Well, first of all, I would never tell an African American what is or isn't racism because I'm not black, but I appreciate that my co-panelist feels the courage to tell a Jewish person what is or isn't anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, though, I will make two concrete points. This bizarre and sudden focus and fascination on free speech is pretty ludicrous, considering 3 years ago, Harvard University was ranked by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions as to how well it preserved free speech and the First Amendment. It was ranked 248th out of 248 American universities, and I don't recall being invited by Al Arabiya to talk about dissent on free speech. It's only when anti-Semitism is involved, all of a sudden, do we start caring about free speech and the First Amendment. Harvard is an institution that routinely disinvites controversial speakers who are deemed allegedly to be transphobic, misogynistic, or racist. This is a university that fired its own president for suggesting that pay disparities between men and women can probably be explained by the fact that women go into less paying professions. This is an institution that unenrolled 12 students who were posting sexist memes in a private WhatsApp group. All of this was happening for years, and no one really talked about it. It was only when Jewish students said that we want to be treated equally under the law, all of a sudden did universities wake up and say, oh, well, we just can't because we have to preserve free speech. It's a ludicrous argument. No one takes it seriously. Again, Harvard was ranked out of given a 0.0 by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions. They have no track record of protecting free speech. But if you want to make this into a free speech argument, then fine, I'm all for free speech. Harvard should be allowed to do whatever it is they would like. What they can't do is say, we're going to do whatever we would like, and then we also demand the American taxpayer pay for it. Again, I used to be far left. Destiny is center left. Why is it that we're defending an institution with billions and billions and billions of dollars? I mean, Florida State University, Vanderbilt, U Chicago, these are great institutions of higher learning. And you know what the difference is between those institutions and Harvard and Columbia and Penn? Is those institutions do not capitulate to the dumbest elements of our society. If you want to protest and violate all time, place, and manner restrictions, then fine, but at least accept the consequences of your actions.
Melinda, can I just jump in for a second? Because, I just want to share with your viewers. I mean, Shabbos, I don't know if your audience knows that, I would take everything he says with a grain of salt. You say that these are some of the dumbest people. I mean, Shabbos, you've written on Instagram, to those who are protesting at Harvard. And by the way, let's be clear, they're not protesting against free speech or for free speech. They're protesting against genocide and ethnic cleansing, which is being widely documented. So that is not anti-Semitism. I'm not telling you what anti-Semitism is, but we can all hopefully agree that anti-Semitism is when you discriminate against Jewish people, not a Zionist regime that is rogue and violating international law and committing crimes against humanity. You wrote in response to an Instagram post, have you considered blowing yourselves up? That would really show the Zionists. So I don't know if that's like a joke or if you just feel as if that's somehow a level of discourse that should be encouraged. But I do want to remind our audience, I mean, there have been numerous students, including Mohsen Mahdawi recently, a Palestinian refugee, a legal permanent resident who devoted over 10 years of his life to building bridges on campus. He approached what he thought was a routine citizenship interview, only to be ambushed by ICE agents inside the office of USCIS in Vermont. Hours later, deportation proceedings were already underway. I mean, Mohsen's story is one story, but it's emblematic of a much larger trend. So for as much as Shabbos wants to make this about Harvard and how much money they have, it's so much bigger than that. I mean, Mohsen, after his meeting with Columbia professor Shai Davide, who, by the way, is a faculty member who, unlike the students, has actually been harassing faculty, students, and administrators, and eventually got suspended, not because he was harassing students, but because administrators were being harassed. He took to Twitter to frame Mohsen and other pro-Palestinian voices as Shabbos is claiming anti-Semitic and even pro-Hamas, as if the thousands of Jewish students across universities that are literally just protesting the genocide and ethnic cleansing and daily slaughter of children, that somehow makes them pro-Hamas. I mean, this was followed, just put yourself in this guy's shoes. This was followed by a digital witch hunt in which websites like Canary Mission and others, as well as a private WhatsApp group of Columbia alumni and faculty, were conspiring to try to get these Palestinian students deported. I mean, the level of danger that this is putting us all in, as Americans, as academics, as simply citizens or non-citizens, cannot be overstated.
Destiny, I'm going to bring you in just a moment, but Shabbos, I'll let you respond to that before we move on to the next question.
Sure. Well, thank you for exposing your academic dishonesty, because you've deliberately left out the first part of my comment, which is to anyone who is calling for an intifada, which for your viewers who don't know, the intifada was the indiscriminate bombing of nursing homes and school buses and nightclubs in Israel.
Okay, we're not going to go back into a history lesson.
Melinda, unfortunately, he's trying to justify his very hateful rhetoric, but that is not what the... You don't want me to explain
just one thing at a time, Ahmed. Let's let Shabbos respond, and then Ahmed will come to you. Just a moment, Ahmed. Shabbos,
he doesn't mischaracterize what the intifada is, because the intifada isn't that. The intifada is a resistance of oppression. Carry on.
Shabbos?
Okay, so by the way, if you want to understand why the American people really don't like these elitist universities, it's because of professors like that, who the moment a student starts responding or a student gives their own opinion, they have to interrupt. So as I was saying, the second intifada was the indiscriminate bombing of school buses and nursing homes and nightclubs to kill as many Jews as possible. Palestinian terrorists would start blowing themselves up all over Israel. My cousin was killed during the second intifada. So I've been very clear for any student who believes that we have to bring the intifada to America, which is what they're chanting at all these universities, then great, blow yourselves up and leave American students alone. If you believe in terrorism, then go do it somewhere else. And I never once characterized free speech and protest as anti-Semitic. What I do characterize as anti-Semitic is when a staff member at Harvard University challenged me to debate him in a secluded underpass as to whether Jews orchestrated 9/11, then posted a video of him waving a machete with a picture of my face, saying he's coming after me and is coming after more than blood. You know what's anti-Semitic? Drawing swastikas on the posters of Jewish hostages like Kfir Bibas, who's a 9-month-old baby, and writing, "His head is still on, where is the evidence?" You know what's anti-Semitic? Following Jews like myself on my way to class during the encampments and recording us. All of those things are anti-Semitic, and it has literally nothing to do with speech. I never once made the point that free speech and exercising your First Amendment rights is anti-Semitic. This has nothing to do with speech, and it has everything to do with criminality and discrimination. And in the same way, the federal government withheld funds from racist schools that refused to integrate in the 1950s. In the same way, the Obama administration tried rescinding and withholding funds from schools that he deemed transphobic or sexist. So too, we should rescind funds and withhold federal funding from any institution that does not follow the law and its federal mandates under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It has nothing to do with speech, and all your listeners can Google exactly what the Intifada was. It was the murder of Jews indiscriminately.
Okay, Destiny, I'm going to let you respond to what we've been hearing before we move on to segment B. I mean, when we hear, two clearly polar opposite views, when you hear that and you think about those views clashing on US university campuses, I mean, what is a way forward? Is there a way forward?
I mean, it's a conversation. I mean, Israel-Palestine is a debate older than anybody here, of course. None of this conversation matters. None of it's relevant to what's being discussed. People can have their viewpoints on this. The reality is if you come into this conversation pretending that the Trump administration cares about anti-Semitism or is trying to save Jews on campus, it's just a lie. Trump is targeting institutions that he feels doesn't agree with his political viewpoint. He's doing the exact same thing with his numerous executive orders targeted towards lawyers, targeted towards law firms, targeted towards the ex-head of CISA. All of these people are being targeted because they have political disagreements with Donald Trump. That's why Columbia, that's why Harvard are being targeted. He might use the anti-Semitism thing as the reason to do it. But if you think that somebody's violating some part of the Civil Rights Act, if you think that a school is acting in some way that's criminal, then go through the criminal process. This administration has demonstrated time and time again that they completely disregard process, they don't care about rule of law, and that they will do whatever tactics they can to bring people underneath their influence and to try to crush them until they have to go along with whatever the Trump administration likes, such as, for example, the recent law firms that have now donated over, $500 million of pro bono work to take themselves out of the crosshair of the administration. Again, like we can go back and forth all day about, I mean, I think it's undeniable that there is a massive undercurrent of anti-Semitism with a lot of the protests at these colleges, but I thought the conservatives said that we should never have hate speech laws, that we shouldn't outlaw hate speech. If people want to protest, if people want to be anti-Semitic, if people want to be anti-Palestinian, if people want to be racist or hateful, you have the right to be that. If you think that an administration is doing this or facilitating this in a way that's violating their obligations under any kind of federal statute, then hold them accountable as such. Don't come out here with these open letters and pretend that you're following some process when it's really just a form of political bullying.
Okay, let's move. Ahmed, really quickly before we move on.
If I can, Melinda, I'll be brief. I just want to correct the record. I mean, Intifada, certainly. I mean, you said that the reason people hate Professors Chabos is because they interrupt. I interrupted you because you are misleading and you are spreading misinformation and you don't understand clearly what the Intifada is. You claim it's about the indiscriminate murder of Israelis. That's not the case. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but I want to clarify it. Intifada is an Arabic word that literally means shaking off. And in the Palestinian context, it's understood to mean a civil uprising. In fact, the first Palestinian Intifada erupted in Gaza after 4 Palestinians were killed when an Israeli truck collided with 2 vans that were carrying Palestinian workers. As for indiscriminate and your use of that word, I think all 3 of us, hopefully, well, at least Melinda, and the other guest who, is not deluded by misinformation and peddling propaganda can agree, like the United Nations, like all human rights groups, that Israel has been indiscriminately bombing Gaza and targeting children, doctors, journalists, UN staff, foreign workers. Anyway, Melinda, all of this is happening, and I hope we can discuss this as well, because I think it was an interesting point that the last guest brought up. This is happening across the US, where the Department of Homeland Security is also simultaneously combing through social media accounts of 1.5 million foreign students, searching exclusively for, quote, anti-Semitic activity. And even though the previous guest said, and the reason I put it in quotes is because when we say there is massive evidence of anti-Semitism amongst the protesters. Let's just distinguish. Anti-Semitism is not simply calling for the dismantling of the Zionist state. That is not anti-Semitic.
Indeed. And we are going to come to that combing of social media in our next segment. But I just quickly want to get a little bit of time on our second segment about this politicizing use of language. We're going to focus on anti-Semitism, but I really want to make it clear to our guests, to our viewers, we're not in any way diminishing the stark rise in anti-Muslim rhetoric or the hate crimes associated with that. But for the purpose of this specific discussion, we're focusing on anti-Semitism because this is the key justification used by the Trump administration to take actions against universities and students. So, Destiny, let me start with you. Do you think that anti-Israel or maybe anti-Netanyahu bias at US universities is being conflated with anti-Semitism?
I want to be ultra crystal clear here. I think in the United States of America, you have a constitutional right to be anti-Semitic. If you want to do a protest and you want to say burn Israel to the ground or I hate Jews or whatever, you absolutely have the right to do that. Okay, I think that should be a protected right. It's part of why our First Amendment is so expansive. So with that in mind, so I'm opposed to all the actions that the Trump administration is taking right now to bully these universities. With that in mind, there's absolutely an undercurrent of anti-Semitism here. Now, for whatever reason, Israelis have not learned how to speak the language of the West anywhere near as much as all of their critics say that they have, and Palestinians have mastered the language of the West. That's why we just got a 10-minute explanation on how intifada definitely just means civil uprisings, despite the fact that the last guest very clearly mentioned the first intifada, which was more of a civil uprising, to distinguish it from the second intifada, which was the indiscriminate killings and bombings of civilians and soldiers alike across all of Israel. That's why the majority of Israeli deaths were civilian. That's why almost 1,000 people died. And even the majority of deaths on the Palestinian side were Palestinians killing other Palestinians because they were suspected collaborators of the IDF. So there is absolutely an undercurrent of violent thought there. There's absolutely a weird equivocation being played on some of the words and a lot of word games that's being played. So for instance, somebody will say the dissolution of the state of Israel isn't anti-Semitic, but then when you ask them what that means, they'll say, well, it should be a single state where Jews are a super minority in the region. And then when you ask them, okay, well, what if people start enacting anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish
rights, regardless
just
of
a moment. I want to turn this over.
Just to be clear, though, that would be a Jewish minority, though. That would be a Jewish minority.
No, but like in the U.S., Destiny, let's just be honest.
The United States, though, but the United States isn't full of people that have spent the entirety of the last 100 years attacking Jews the same way that the Arab states have, right?
I'm sorry, no, that's factually incorrect.
Which part of that was factually incorrect?
When Jewish immigrants started coming from Europe, they were welcomed with open arms by people like my grandparents, who were then ethnically cleansed, as you know, the Nakba in 1948.
So they weren't always welcomed with open arms. There were times where they were welcome, and there were times where as early as 1920 in Iran, there was a massacre of Jewish people. These happened all across the Palestinian Mandate. There was a reason why in 47, the whole reason why Israel eventually declared independence was because all of the Palestinians there tried to do a civil war and lost, and then all the Arab states joined in war and lost. This is where all this happens. In 48 and in 67 and 73, there was a massive exodus of Jews from all of the surrounding Arab countries because of their pogroms, because of other types of discrimination that Jews were facing due to Israel. This is basic history. Of course, the Palestinians will rewrite the history here. Not that it matters. We should be deporting
Palestinians are not rewriting history.
It's just a certain.
Destiny, I just want to, it's important that we don't demonize the Arabs who were threatening the Jews. The reason that the Jews were so threatened historically, not to suggest that they weren't in the Arab world as well, was primarily the same reason we see Germany and the rest of Europe not moving, despite them having an obligation to prevent the current genocide. It involves the guilt that they feel because of the fact that they were the ones that genocided and ethnically cleansed the Jewish people. And that's why it was maybe something that they would support to send. It was a very convenient thing for them to send Jewish people away from their land and to, the Holy Land. And so I was just taking issue with the fact that when people say Zionism
have the Arabs not been trying to cleanse the Jews from the Middle East since at least 1936?
I'm sorry, what? No, they weren't. No, they haven't been. The Arabs as a monolith were trying.
Okay, let's bring in Shahbaz. Shahbaz, respond to what both of our guests there have been debating about. Talk us through it. What's your point of view?
Sure, but first I need to make a broad point. There's only one professor on this panel, and it's a professor who keeps interrupting. I mean, this is why higher education is so flawed these days.
I'm going to interrupt and say I'm not a
viewers
professor.
need to hear three distinct perspectives. That is their right. And we can't do it if people... Thank you for proving my point. You need to listen to other people and have basic respect. And if you don't want to agree with me, fine, but just stop interrupting. It's like childish. It's just childish. This is why young people are just so fed up with these institutions. Just stop interrupting. Jesus. So here's the point. I couldn't agree with Destiny more. There should not be hate speech laws. Anti-Semitism is constitutionally protected speech. Islamophobia is constitutionally protected speech. Racist speech, sexist speech, it's abhorrent. I condemn it, of course, but it's protected. Jewish students, myself included, are not asking for special treatment under the law. We're asking for equal treatment under the law. And Destiny brought up this point of there should be criminal proceedings, and that's actually what we're doing. So we filed a lawsuit against Harvard last year. It's the first lawsuit in American history pertaining to the civil rights violations of Jewish students on a college campus to actually go to trial. Harvard filed 2 separate motions to dismiss, and that was rejected. In fact, the Judge Richard Stearns, even wrote that it would be dubious for Harvard to try to hide under the First Amendment when almost everything we were entailing had nothing to do with speech, and it had everything to do with criminality. It had everything to do with action. It is a big fiction, and it's a damning indictment on the mainstream media that they have concocted this narrative whereby we can only defend Jewish students or we can only defend speech, when the two are not in conflict with each other at all. And if you're so concerned about speech, then I would actually encourage you to look at the letter that the Federal Anti-Semitism Task Force and the Trump administration put out and released at Harvard. And it said you have to have viewpoint diversity because right now a Harvard Crimson study found that 97% of the Harvard faculty identify as liberal. And I'm sort of a liberal, but I know that that's really not good for higher education when all the professors think one way. If you look at the Anti-Semitism Task Force letter, they say that you can only have merit-based admissions criteria as opposed to asking people their sexual orientation, their racial identity, their socioeconomic background. The letter also says you have to ban masks because protesters continuously say wear a mask so you can't be held accountable for your actions. These are basic reforms. And again, if any institution don't want to do these reforms, that is their prerogative. They don't have to do them. All it means is that the federal government won't be subsidizing them. And again, I don't understand why this suddenly became controversial because we're talking about corporations and elitist institutions with billions and billions of dollars. As it pertains to Israel-Palestine specifically, the idea that the Intifada simply means shaking off is ludicrous. Seek Heil simply means hail victory, but we know what the obvious historical connotations are, which is why, before he was killed, Yahya Sinwar went on Al Jazeera and said explicitly that it would be a great thing for everyone on college campuses to call for the free Palestine from the river to the sea, because even though that's constitutionally protected speech, it was pretty clear that freeing Palestine from the river to the sea meant the destruction of the Jewish state from the Jordanian River to the Mediterranean Sea. So we can't pretend that there are these innocuous or well-meaning students who don't actually know what they're talking about and they believe... You have to stop interrupting me. It is unbelievable. You're like, how old are you? It's unbelievable.
All right, well then I'll do the interrupting. I'll hand it over to Ahmed.
Innocent, innocuous students
Ahmed,
don't know what they're talking about, and they believe in this peaceful coexistence.
He asked me a question. Can I answer the question?
Go ahead, Ahmed.
You asked me how old I am. I'm 40 years old. And I interrupted you by saying that's not true because it is our job to make sure, whether as a guest or a panelist, that when lies and misinformation is being spread, that I challenge it. You said earlier, Shabbos, interestingly enough, quoting you verbatim, Jewish students are asking for equal treatment under law. That is exactly at the heart of the movement to liberate the Palestinian people from oppression, occupation, and apartheid. Because as I'm sure we can all agree, Palestinian students, journalists, doctors, mothers, inside of Israel, inside of the West Bank and Gaza, are simply asking for the same thing. Why not treat them equally under law? And by the way, when you bring up, from the river to the sea and how we can understand that to mean that they want to genocide the Jews, that is your interpretation and you're using that for certain reasons. That is also in the Likud charter. So when Netanyahu and others say it, including Jewish people on campus, they're not penalized, they're not prosecuted, it's not controversial. But when Palestinians who have suffered from decades of oppression, occupation, and ethnic cleansing, as we're seeing in our feeds every day, simply say, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, They're talking about their historical land, which has been taken from them. Now, I don't want to get sidelined into like how old I am and why I'm interrupting you when you're spreading misinformation. What I want to agree with Destiny on is that we are seeing, this purge of voices, not voices that are anti-Semitic, but voices that are challenging Israel's countless war crimes. Today, students and professors are even being detained, disappeared off the streets, not because of crimes, but simply because they dare speak out against their tax dollars being used to commit genocide. Let's look at the Texas legislature. They passed a law requiring public and charter schools to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Under this law, even a measured critique of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and its massacres, the daily massacres in Gaza. It's not, these are not opinions that I have about these massacres. These are hard, cold facts. That they're killing or injuring 100 children a day since they violated the ceasefire. That's the United Nations, not me. But maybe, I wouldn't be surprised if Shabbos thinks like Israel and everyone else that the United Nations is Hamas. The point is, Melinda, teachers and students are being disciplined, being disappeared, for even recounting the historical reality of the creation of Israel, which is a history rife with documented massacres of Palestinians and acts of ethnic cleansing. And not only does this directly violate the Constitution and First Amendment, but it also violates the spirit of academic freedom that I think is so coveted by so many people around the world when it comes to higher education in the US. So Melinda, I think we must ask if the goal of the Trump administration was really to combat real anti-Semitism, which I admit is a major issue, not just in the United States, but around the world. Why are we not prosecuting the KKK or the neo-Nazis chanting hateful slogans at Charlottesville? It's because this isn't about protecting any community or any human beings in the US. It's about shielding Israel, a rogue state that is committing genocide, from any accountability for its crimes against humanity.
Okay, I'm going to bring Destiny in on that comment in just a moment, but Shabbos, I saw you raising your hand, so I'll give you a quick right of reply, and then Destiny, I've got a question for you on what Ahmed just said.
Sure. Well, first of all, I point out I wanted to correct the record, but I patiently waited for my panelists to finish speaking as opposed to interrupting. The IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, definition of anti-Semitism does not in any way criminalize criticism of the State of Israel. Take it from someone who was in the State of Israel last month speaking at a conference run by the Israeli government and used the opportunity to criticize the Israeli government. The idea that there is some nefarious actors out there who are creating legislation that penalizes criticisms against a state is ludicrous. Again, if you ever go to Israel, you would know that it is essentially a national pastime to criticize Israeli policies and the Israeli government. No one is saying that speech should be criminalized. And by the way, as Destiny's point already articulated, there are protections for free speech, whether it's anti-Palestinian or whether it's anti-Semitism. Those should be protected. The people who are being prosecuted or the institutions that are being sued against has nothing to do with speech. It has everything to do with conduct and criminality. This is not really a debate on Israel's actions in the Middle East, although I'm happy to come back and talk about it. The issue that we're discussing today are rogue institutions like Harvard, Penn, Columbia, UCLA, you name it, that have taken American taxpayer dollars and then have used those dollars to fund programs, to fund speakers that are anti-American, that don't hold our values, that in many cases violate the law, like the United States Supreme Court found just 2 years ago. Harvard was discriminating against Asian Americans, and those institutions should finally be held accountable, whether it's under the guise of anti-Semitism, whether it's under the guise of cutting government waste, whether it's under the guise of institutional reform. At the end of the day, there is an obvious alignment that we have corrupt institutions that don't serve the interests of the American people, and it is in our own best interest to reform those institutions. It's a relatively simple argument. At its core, the showdown is between Harvard insisting on violating the civil rights of Jews and the Trump administration saying, fine, we're just not going to fund those violations of said civil rights.
We're going to come to American values really shortly. Destiny, let me just ask you, I want you to respond to something that Ahmed was talking about. Is there a sense that the Trump administration is prioritizing anti-Semitism over other forms of hate speech, even though we have said, yes, it's protected under the First Amendment, it doesn't mean it's okay? Is there a priority on that particular type of hate speech over other forms? Do you believe?
Man, I got huge disagreements with both sides of this conversation right now. But yeah, there is an obsession with the anti-Semitic thing, but it's just because Israel plays well with the older demographic in the United States, and Trump sees it as a very safe option to be a full Israeli simp. There's a reason why a lot of people in Israel, and Netanyahu included, have massive support for Trump, because Trump has massive support for Israel. But the issue is Trump is just picking the things that allows him to attack his political opponents. Trump doesn't care about anti-Semitism. He cares that he finally has a good avenue to attack universities through. Again, if we felt like this was a huge issue across schools in the United States, then do like Shabbos is doing, then sue them, take them to court, have the DOJ file a case against them for some kind of wrongful thing. He keeps referring to the Supreme Court decision getting rid of affirmative action. That went through the courts. It was a Supreme Court decision. And then Harvard and all the other universities in the United States had to follow through. If we feel like there's something that universities are doing, then don't call out a particular university. Either pass a new law or enforce the laws on the books, or take somebody to court if you feel like they're doing some kind of criminally wrongful action, and actually have that argument in front of the American people. Stop writing these letters to political opponents like he's done with every other political opponent in the United States, whether we're talking about suing news stations for giving interviews or polls that he doesn't like, or whether we're talking about targeting law firms because lawyers worked with political opponents that he didn't like, and now it's targeting schools because they have viewpoints that he doesn't like. We just got rid of the Department of Education because we wanted the government to stop dictating opinions and to stop dictating curriculum to schools. So why is the president targeting these two universities, one of which buckled, Columbia, and wasn't even given any reprieve from the administration's bullying tactics on it? So again, if you feel like it's a problem, go through the correct process. Process is important, essential, I would say.
Shabbos, if you think that there is an anti-Israel bias, anti-Semitism on college campuses, where do you think that's coming from? Why do you think we're seeing it now? And have we seen it in the past, but we're only talking about it now?
Sure. So again, it's not just to do with an anti-Israel bias. No one is talking about the importance of curtailing speech and people's political opinions. Look, it's obvious that these institutions have a far left bias, but that's not the issue we're discussing. Where does it come from? Look, at its peak, Harvard was 25% Jewish. Today, it's 4% Jewish. It's not because Jews got dumber over time. It's because there's been a deliberate and systemic campaign to crack down on the amount of Jews at Harvard University. I'm not saying we're victims in this case, but I am saying that I believe through the DEI process, where you create a victimhood Olympics, where you rank people based on their sexual orientation, their racial identity, their socioeconomic statuses, Jews have the misfortune in the United States of being mischaracterized as white. And whether it was 4 babies or 40,000 babies who were beheaded on October 7th, it really doesn't matter, because as my classmates will tell you, as they've told me to my face, resistance is justified when people are occupied. It's the same reason that people my age, people 18 to 26, overwhelmingly support what Luigi Mangione did of killing the United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Why? Because if you are a victim of this society in this really grandiose, non-tangible way, then you could kind of do whatever you want to get rid of that unjust society. And there is no greater display of injustice. And again, I know the debate is not Israel-Palestine. Happy to come back to talk about that later. But for whatever reason, there's no greater symbol of injustice than the Palestinian people, which is why you have this really bizarre coalition of far-left socialist groups, of LGBTQ coalitions, of radical Islamic fundamentalists who all kind of come together on campuses in support of the Palestinian cause. And I would say a lot of it has to do with DEI and this insistence that we have to judge people based on race, based on class, based on sexual orientation. And it's interesting, going back to the Supreme Court ruling that Harvard was discriminated against minority students in affirmative action. What's interesting is the next day, Harvard University put out a statement basically saying we're going to curtail the Supreme Court's ruling. So the problem is we don't really have an enforcement. And because there's no enforcement of law, the government's saying, well, we're not going to fund it anymore.
Melinda, if I may just correct the record, or at least answer his
really briefly
question
for me, though, Ahmed, before I move on to Destiny, please.
Okay, well, go ahead. I don't need to interject if you don't want me to. They just
No, go ahead. Go ahead. We want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I just want to say the reason that, LGBTs and other people, as he referenced, are coming together, it might just be because they're marginalized groups who know what it's like to be so perpetually dehumanized by the political and media establishment. And there's this thing, whether you like it or not, called intersectional resistance, which is people who are marginalized, who are dehumanized, coming together to rally behind each other. Also, if I can add, it seems history is repeating itself. Columbia University, again, where I was a professor and I'm no longer a professor, Shabbos. In 1933, you might know or have studied that Columbia students protested Nazi violence against Jews. And in a stunning reversal, we saw the administration welcome the anti-Semitic Nazi ambassador, Hans Luther. And if you fast forward to today, Columbia students who are protesting not Judaism, not anything related to Judaism, but rather the Israeli state's genocidal war of annihilation in Gaza. And instead of protecting free speech, Columbia invited a former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, who, by the way, in my opinion, is a war criminal based on the fact that he brags repeatedly that he's killed many Arabs in his life, and there's no problem with that. So I just, Melinda, want to make sure that we stay focused on what we were supposed to discuss, which is the sort of surge of repressive measures that are aimed at not silencing dissent against Jewish people or attacks on Jewish people. So I think it's a misnomer. It's not accurate. It's misleading to suggest that at college campuses, many of these protests are led by Jewish students themselves, especially the ones at Columbia. And you see someone like Marco Rubio. I mean, let's just get to the reason why people are being disappeared. We haven't even discussed that. Mm-hmm. But Melinda, we talk about Mahmoud and the other students who've been disappeared and at Tufts and at Columbia. Well, they're not being prosecuted for any criminal conduct. Maybe the other panelists can explain to me. I understand there's an archaic law from 1952 that's granting the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, this broad authority to deport anyone deemed to be a threat to U.S. foreign policy. It's being weaponized against these students. Currently, it's being weaponized against students who are pro-Palestinian or Palestinian themselves. But I want to know, what are the crimes? What are the actual crimes? I mean, there's been no evidence of criminal misrepresentations, even on Mahmoud's green card. All that I believe was offered in support of his case was a 2-page memo by Marco Rubio containing no allegations of criminal conduct, but simply arguing that Mahmoud Khalil should be expelled from America, not just from Columbia, for beliefs that undermine core American interests. What are those beliefs? I'd like to know.
It's interesting that you asked that, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about in our final segment here on Counterpoints. It's no secret that Donald Trump and the wider MAGA movement dislike the views that they deem anti-American or hostile to America. Mm-hmm. And one of the US government's demands to Harvard include reporting students to the federal government who they believe are hostile to American values. And yet it's unclear from what we've heard from the administration thus far who will determine what a hostile view is, and perhaps equally unclear what exactly American values are. So, Destiny, how do you think we should define American values, but how do you think the government is interpreting them in a political way? And should people with hostile views be reported to the government?
There have been, I'm 36 years old, there have been so many different groups that were supposed to be a threat to what it meant to be an American or a threat to U.S. values. It was, when I was growing up, it was illegal immigrants, it was Mexican invaders. After 9/11, it was supposed to be Muslims and Arabs and Islam. Then it was ISIS. And, people have always identified all of these external enemies, usually non-white, that were supposed to come and destroy this country. When I look at the greatest threat right now to American values in the United States, it is the Trump administration, bar none. Make no mistake, I disagree almost completely with I would call it the pro-Palestinian historical revisionism that goes on their side. But that being said, I mean, we have a current administration that doesn't believe in rule of law. There is a process, and you need to follow this process. And I can't think of anything more insane to me than deporting students from the United States of America because you have a viewpoint disagreement with them. From a selfish level, these people come in, oftentimes they pay full tuition and they subsidize their own students. These are some of the best and brightest students around the world, despite how crazy their political views may be. And also, as a side note, their political views should be a little bit crazy. They're kids. They're 18 to 22, who wasn't an insane person, who wasn't picking up Ayn Rand or the Communist Manifesto, or, in the past might have been protesting Vietnam or whatever. Like, kids always have radical beliefs. And I think it's worth addressing, where's the external influence on some of these beliefs. I think that's fine to address, but we are throwing away like one of our most important avenues to accessing talent around the world as a result of this administration and the unilateral way that they're going about everything. It's not even done through the entire executive department. It's done from Donald Trump himself. He wills it, he writes it, into an EO, or he has one handed to him, and then he signs it, and then it's carried out. If there are things that you don't like, you have an entire Congress, you have both halves of it with Republican majorities, use them. If you think somebody's breaking the law, use your Department of Justice. They did it with Eric Adams to try to do a quid pro quo with him. They did that successfully. So sue these organizations, sue these universities, charge them with crimes if you think, and then let the cases play out. I can't think of any greater threat to American values right now in the United States than Donald Trump and the way that his administration is just tearing through the rule of law in this country.